I want to acknowledge that even though we are not at Royal Roads on site, that the university does rest on the location, that the university does rest on the traditional lands of both the Kusapsum and the Lekwungen, the Esquimalt and Songhees ancestors and families who have lived on this land for thousands of years. The land has been part of the fabric of the life of Indigenous communities long before Hatley Castle was built, and it will be long into the future. It is with gratitude that we now learn and work here, where the past, present, and future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. I'd also like to acknowledge that from where I am here in Sydney, the land that I am on is associated with the Sowet, the Sartlip, the Siam, the Pakachin, and the Malahat First Nations. I wanted to say again, just a welcome to everyone and thank you for joining us today. For anybody, I'm sure I just had a look at who's online. If you don't know me, I'm Deborah Zorns. I am the Director of the Office of Research Services. I'd like to also introduce you and just acknowledge our team. So our team includes, as our Research Development Coordinators, Gwen Hill, Melanie Robel, Vanessa Rogers, and Jenny Sigalet, and Tabitha Rutherford, who is our Administrative Coordinator. Just a couple of quick housekeeping pieces. We are recording this session and we will be monitoring the chat. So if you'd like to pop any questions throughout the presentation in the chat box, we will respond to those at the end. We'll also turn the recording off for the questions at the end. And any questions that we're unable to get to within the time allowed, we will send out an email with the answers to those questions. And on that note, it gives me pleasure to turn this over now to our RDC team, and over to you, Gwen.
Thank you, Deb. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am going to do a run-through of our proposal process. So this is going to be fairly quick. It's a fairly quick list. We will be sharing the slides, so don't worry about memorizing or writing everything down. I'm just going to run through, for anyone who hasn't done a proposal or hasn't done one in a while, the ideal way that we would like them to go. So, of course, we love it. The earlier, the better. We would love to get everyone as many reviews of drafts as we can, and we'd also really highly encourage peer review. It really shows up in success statistics. So the higher we can increase your odds of funding, the earlier we can get partners, co-applicants, collaborators on board and get through the online pieces, the better we generally do. So the first stage in our process is the pre-approval. This gets things on the books with us and with your deans. It gives us an idea of who we may need to give a heads up to or connect with on any planning sections. So that's IT, Indigenous Education and Student Services, and CTET. And also in our office, we assign a lead and a backup at that point. So we then move to the templates and the timelines. That's something that we develop in our office and we will send to you to work in. And while you're working in that, we ask that you also get your co-applicants and collaborators invited and on board so that they can start the process. And of course, we're here to help them. For a lot of folks, these tri-agency proposals are new, particularly for international or partner organizations that are non-academic. So again, the earlier the better with them. And while you are working on the first draft, we also ask that you connect with the library on research data management. This is going to be a mandatory piece going forward, and the library has some wonderful resources and can help you figure out how to integrate that into your proposal. So once we get that first draft back to us, we can review for equity, diversity, and inclusion aspects, and that is something that I will go into in a little bit more depth later on. But your lead will review your first draft and get a copy back to you, usually within a couple of days. And then we ask that the next thing we see is the other pieces. So that's the knowledge mobilization, the team section, student training section, any online drop-downs. There's a lot generally with SSHRC. There are a lot of online drop-downs that generate text boxes, so we don't like those to be surprises at the end. Once we've had a look at that, we can set a meeting with you to go over your budget and budget justification piece. We really do need the rest of it in place for that so that we know what we need to budget for. We'll then provide everything back to you, so you now have basically a complete package of the proposal. And the next thing that will come back to our office is a second draft. We hope that it's a second draft if it's early enough, because we'd like to see and provide a review on the whole top to bottom proposal. But if we are too close to submission deadline, then that would be considered your final draft. So for that stage, you will get your lead will review again, the second on your proposal will review, and if we have time, we'll also ask that Deb review in her capacity as a director, and we will do a reference check and an APA review. Again, that's kind of one of the first things to go if we don't have a lot of time near the submission. So that's then back to you to upload everything onto your online platform and compile it to a PDF, which we will use to send for final approval. Final approval goes through 3 levels of institutional approval, and we ask for 2 days, or we have been asked to give 2 days per level of approval. So that's 6 business days. So if you want to just add, consider that you'll need a little more than a week before the submission deadline. And of course, that will all be in the timeline that we send back at the beginning. You will then submit your proposal once we confirm that approval has been received. That submission comes to us for an institutional review and submission, which we then do on our end, and you're done. And with that, I'm sorry, I know that was a lot of information really quickly. I'm happy to talk about it more at the end. I'm going to pass this over to Vanessa.
Thanks, Gwen. I'm going to do a really quick rundown of some of the funding opportunities offered by SSHRC. The one thing that I that struck me as I was going through these is that I've been doing this for a number of years, and every time I go through a funding opportunity, I think of it in a slightly different way, depending on what else I've come across that year. I think of new ideas each time. And so I really encourage you to, even if you've applied for a SSHRC opportunity in the past, that you take the time to read the full funding opportunity description again, because it's very grounding in terms of the purpose of the fund and the criteria that your application will be assessed against. And you'll think of way more ideas than I possibly could about how that particular funding opportunity applies to your project. So with that, I'll do a little quick comparison of a couple of grants that you have probably already heard of, the Insight and the Insight Development grants. They've got some similarities, but also a number of differences. They both respond to the objectives of the Insight program, and that's something else that's worth a read on the SSHRC website. It's just a page long or so, but generally, they support research excellence in the social sciences and humanities. The Insight tends to support stable, longer-term research initiatives, whereas the Insight Development grant is meant to support research in its initial stages. It's shorter term, so things like pilot initiatives and case studies tend to fall under that. With the Insight, funding is available to emerging and established scholars alike. But with the Insight Development, 50% of funds are reserved for emerging scholars. And if you think you might be an emerging scholar, you can just Google that definition, and there are a number of ways you can qualify for that. The deadline. So this year, the Insight deadline is October 1st. It's been for years and years and years, October 15th, but this looks like that'll stay as their deadline now. And if you think about that institutional deadline that Gwen was talking about, that would mean getting a final proposal ready for approvals. I think, don't quote me, but I think it's around September 25th. And the Insight Development is a February deadline. And I just want to mention that even though SSHRC has these deadlines, there's nothing to stop us from working with you at a different time of year, because the application forms don't change very much. So if you want to work on an Insight in February or May, we could put it through the exact same process. and we've done that before. We're happy to do it anytime. The scale of the two grants in terms of the time and the amount awarded is different. That reflects the different purpose of the funding opportunity. Both of the grants, unfortunately, have different CVs, which you'd know if you've ever applied to both. You think you have a SSHRC CV, and then all of a sudden you need to do a new one. So that's just something to factor into your scheduling as you're preparing to do a proposal. And there are a few eligibility considerations if you're planning on applying for an insight and an insight development back to back in either order. So just ask us. Usually you can do that, but just maybe check in with us at an early stage so we can help you navigate that. I just want to draw your attention to these. This is part of the funding opportunity description. They're the headings for the criteria that your proposal will be evaluated against. And for each SSHRC opportunity, there are different weightings given to each group of criteria. And I don't expect you to be able to read this, but this is taken from the SSHRC, the insight opportunity. And so each category has a number of different criteria, and this is exactly what your proposal is evaluated against. So each of those bullets there, your reviewer will give you a score for each thing listed there. So that's important to keep in mind. The Partnership Engage grants, we really wanted to tell you about these because we think they may have been a little bit undersubscribed as of yet. They really suit the type of research that RRU faculty tend to be known for. They provide short-term support for partnered research activities that will inform decision-making at a single partner organization. So that organization can be from the public, private, or not-for-profit sector. It can be a Canadian or international organization. So if you know of an organization who's grappling with some kind of challenge, organization-specific need, or trying to figure out a way to take advantage of a particular opportunity, this could be a nice option. There are 4 deadlines for this funding opportunity spread throughout the year, which is nice because then you can really apply to or you can address a really like emergent issue. The September 15th deadline this year also has a special call attached to it, which is for a COVID-19 related issue. So if you know of an organization that's dealing with a COVID-19 related challenge, which I'm sure pretty much everyone is, that could be a good option. Or you could apply for a regular Partnership Engage grant September 15th. They're both open at that time. They are 1-year grants, $7,000 to $25,000 in support. There's some expectation of partner contributions, but it doesn't have to be cash. It can be in kind, and it's not specified for this one, the amount. So if that's something you need help brainstorming, we can definitely help with that. And I just wanted to point out that the challenge criteria for this one is worth 60%. Which I think really speaks to that problem-solving nature of the funding opportunity. But that's not to say that in order to address those challenge criteria, the proposal would also need to speak to the academic challenge or issue arising from the literature, and that would be something common to all SSHRC grants. There are other partnership grants offered by SSHRC, so if you have an idea for a project that involves more than one partner, please feel free to talk to us and we can hopefully steer you in the right direction. The connection grants, well, they support opportunities to exchange knowledge and to engage on research issues of value to those participating. Most of the ones I've worked on have been conferences or occasionally workshops. If they can be used as a first step toward a longer term project. So something like a workshop, which would be bringing people together, is something that's possible. The events and outreach activities are categorized a little bit differently under this funding opportunity. There's 4 deadlines for this one too, which is nice. They're 1-year projects. And events and outreach are sort of categorized differently according to scale. So events are considered shorter term activities that take place. The knowledge exchange aspect takes place usually within a week or less. So conferences and events, or conferences and workshops fall into that category. Outreach are meant to be take place over a longer time period and also engage a broader public in social sciences and humanities knowledge. And this one kind of surprised me when I was looking at it because the website gives a lot of examples for outreach activities. And I thought this could be an area for RU faculty as well, given that, you know, the pandemic environment that we're in, and RU faculty expertise in online learning and online experiences. You might be able to come up with a creative way to do some of these things remotely that hasn't been done before. I'm just going to read a few of the ideas that are on the website, but not even all of them. There's lots there. Things like media events such as television or radio presentations. This is for the outreach category. All of these summer schools / institutes, speaker series, public debates, artistic exhibits, performances or festivals, development / use of interactive technologies, audiovisual products or software, development use of educational aids, instruments or equipment, and also things like development of policy briefs, knowledge synthesis, and scoping reviews, and virtual networking. There's a lot of ideas on there. So if that interests you, I encourage you to take a look. There's a matching contribution requirement for this one, but we can help you brainstorm ideas for that. In terms of special calls, I mentioned the Partnership Engage COVID-19 call already with the September deadline. And about once a year or so, SSHRC also puts out a call for knowledge synthesis grants. They usually are to support SSHRC future challenge areas, which is also an interesting thing to read if you have time. I think there's about 16 future challenge areas. And while most of the grants don't reserve any funding for them, SSHRC does track sort of the number of people who whose projects fall into those categories, and it wouldn't hurt to, you know, say in your application if your project addresses one or more of their future challenge areas. And like the next knowledge synthesis opportunity is supposed to be released this summer. I don't know if that'll still happen, but it's supposed to be called Working in the Digital Economy. And then the one after that for the fall of 2021 is supposed to be the Emerging Asocial Society. And both of those are one of SSHRC's future challenge areas. I think that's all for upcoming funding opportunities. I'll turn it back to Gwen to talk about EDI. Thanks.
Thanks, Vanessa. I just wanted to say a quick reminder too that if you do have questions as we go through this, please do post them in the chat. Deb's monitoring it, and I know that it can be challenging to keep that kind of thing in mind as we go through this massive amount of information here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about EDI and research proposals, which is becoming a mandatory part of tri-agency CRC Secretariat proposals. And we have now a number of studies, and I'll talk a little bit more about some examples of those and give you some resources later, that show that the consideration of sex, gender, and diversity has the potential to make research more ethically sound, rigorous, and useful. The tri-agencies have a goal of achieving a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive Canadian research enterprise. And to that end, they've released the following statement, and I'm just going to read a short quote from it. Systemic barriers within academia and the research ecosystem are well documented. To address these persistent systemic barriers within the ecosystem, individuals at all levels in research must play a sustained role in their mitigation. This requires that all individuals recognize that barriers exist, develop a strong understanding of what the barriers are and their consequences, and understand how researchers can play a role in addressing them. So what I'm going to talk about now is how we can look at addressing some issues of inclusion and diversity in proposal development. The first one we'll look at is team composition and recruitment processes. So unless you're applying to NSERC, CIHR, or the CRC Secretariat, you are not likely to have a dedicated section that will allow you to explain how inclusion factors into your research proposal. SSHRC expects researchers to have EDI considerations integrated into the text of the proposal. And I know that sounds a bit onerous, but it relies largely on making your methods explicit, your recruitment planning and explicit, and just showing an understanding of how diversity relates and connects to your proposed work. So it sounds like it's going to be a lot of work. It's really just demonstration and explicitness in the language that you use, and that's what we're here to help with. So for team composition, researchers have an opportunity here to clearly demonstrate that diversity was taken into consideration within team composition, and I'll give an example. So you could just, in that section, you could identify practice put into place to ensure that you have intentional considerations of inclusion. For example, you could commit to connecting with HR's EDI specialists, which is a new role but should be filled by the end of this month, to ensure that your recruitment postings are inclusive and that specialist will participate in the hiring process. That assumes that you've not already hired a team, which is not often the case for insights. So if you have already hired a team, you can demonstrate an understanding of gendered language and how it impacts a research team, and remove it from any sort of documentation or training materials that you prepare. You can also be specific about how you will provide accommodation and consider leaves and other gaps in experience with your team. The second place that you can address this is in your training and development opportunities for teams. So this is often for student RAs. And again, this can be part of the detailed description, or you can fit it directly into the team section. And an example for this would be to provide equal development opportunities to all student RAs by ensuring that they can either all co-author a publication or all attend a conference. Now I know, and Melanie's going to talk about this in a bit, that the funds are not always available for an entire team to attend a conference, and I also know that it can be frowned upon to say that a large chunk of your budget is going to go to taking your entire team to a conference, for example. So if the funds aren't available to do all of that, then maybe what you do is you make sure that the process for deciding who goes or who presents or who co-authors is fair and transparent. And just being explicit about that, understanding that it's something that needs to be done, is enough to acknowledge that you have a certain baseline of understanding of how inclusion in research needs to work. We can also highlight training that's provided by Royal Roads, so things like the positive space sessions, other training and inclusion activities provided by the Diversity Action Group, training on identifying and addressing microaggressions, and hopefully we'll have a few more coming in the year to come. So the biggest place, and probably the most complicated one, is in the design of the project itself. So for this, I'm just going to read another quote here from the National Centers for Excellence, which say that the extrapolation of research results to the population of a whole, when they only apply to a portion of the population, is inaccurate and can lead to serious implications. Designing fulsome research projects means that the researcher systematically examines how differences in identity factors such as sex, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, age, and mental or physical ability affect the outcomes of research and the impacts of research findings. The purpose is to promote rigorous research that considers identity factors so that the results are impactful and relevant to the diversity of the Canadian population. Now this is a bit more complicated. I can't give a simple example of how you can integrate inclusion into a research project because it's going to be specific for every single research project. But we are here to help with that, and we have some resources that, again, I'll talk about in a minute that can help you learn more about how you can make your research proposal and your research design a little bit more inclusive by design. So the final piece that I'll talk about here is dissemination. Now, we know that dissemination has been a moving target for the last 10 years or so for the tri-agencies, so planning it into a proposal means trying to hit all possible avenues of dissemination. I know that can be a bit overwhelming. Making research publications open access is mandatory, so that can be discussed in your knowledge mobilization piece and is considered an inclusive practice. But you can also consider what communities could benefit from your knowledge and how can you get this information to them. Are there government agencies that could use the results of the research for policy development, for example? And if so, is there someone in an appropriate ministry that you can connect with to put a plan in place if you receive the funding? And what not-for-profit or non-government organizations could benefit? And is there a way to put a similar plan in place with the contacts there? So these are specifically community government agencies and NFPs or NGOs. That's another argument for starting earlier on in the year, because building those kind of plans and sharing and understanding that it's sort of dependent on receipt of funding, and then being able to put a solid relationship and commitment into a proposal like an insight or an insight development really can make the proposal shine. If that's something that you would like to develop, that's when, like Vanessa was saying, that's when we can look at more of the partnership engage grants. But it really is worth developing those relationships. So as promised, I have a few resources and we'll share the slides. So these are hyperlinked. If you work with CIHR applications, many of them now require that you complete the gender-based analysis plus. Even if you don't work with CIHR, I would strongly recommend checking out that GBA Plus system, because it's an excellent sort of overarching coverage of how intersectionality impacts inclusion and how that is how that may impact your work. So and it's not a lengthy piece of training, but it's definitely worth having a look at. So then there are a few peer-reviewed pieces in here. The intersectionality informed quantitative research primer is excellent. I've included the NSERC framework on EDI guidelines. Those are so they reference a section that doesn't exist in SSHRC applications, but the guidelines and the recommendations that they provide are incredible. And SSHRC's EDI dashboard is it's not as fulsome as the NSERC framework, but I would recommend giving it a once over, because then you can start to use some of that funder language that's so important. And with that, I'm going to pass this over to Melanie.
Okay, just getting my camera going here. All right, I'm going to talk about advice from the experts. So we reached out to our faculty who had sat on SSHRC review teams and asked them for their tips, things that they would share from their experiences as reviewers. So our thanks in this section go to Francis Jorgensen, Philip Bonini, Mark Lokanen, and Rob Middleman. So first, choose a research topic that's interesting and memorable. Choose a topic that stands out from the crowd. Avoid research topics that are plucked straight out of what's hot in the news. Also, state your research question clearly and show why it is important. Make sure that it's clear why the question is important, because SSHRC wants to fund research questions and proposals that are compelling. If you are an established scholar, be very clear that it is a new line of inquiry or methods and how it is different from what you've done before. For your methodology, make sure your methods are elegantly simple, as one person put it. Make sure that there is a solid theoretical foundation and research methodology for the study. And make the adjudication committee your audience when writing. The adjudication committee is inherently interdisciplinary, and while there will be someone from your discipline there, it doesn't mean they will read your submission. So write as clearly as possible and use non-technical language while still sounding like you know what you were doing and up on both seminal and most recent publications and trends in your field. Have someone who is not familiar with your research read the entire application to make sure it will be understood by an educated layperson. And also have an editor go through to do a review for silly spelling errors, grammatical, syntactical errors, and to make sure that all of the details are included, for example, your page numbers, to make sure that for the uploads that the name on the top of the page is correct. Follow the instructions carefully and address what each section is looking for. I know it's so easy to say, oh, I've done this before, I know what this is about. But I know for myself, being a new person in this field, still learning, you really pay attention to what are the drop downs for that section, what are they really looking for. It can be a good guide even if you haven't done it before. It's a good guide. Be sure that the objective comes early in the application and is very clear. Make the proposal summary pop. It should be compelling. The summary is key. Reviewers have a lot of files to read and discuss. It is not always clear that they have time to read the full 5-page proposal when we get to discussion, so the summary is very important. And include a clear statement of your research question and why it's important. Streamline your budget. Justification on budget items is key. Don't add unnecessary items to your budget. And don't add too many students. Justify why you need a PhD student over an MA or an undergrad student. Be thrifty about your budgeted conference travel and avoid looking like you're just after fun trips to interesting cities. Keep in mind that year one conference travel money almost always gets cut. And with open access fees, don't be too unrealistic about what you will be able to do in a 1 or 2 year period. With your literature review, of course, cite relevant, contemporary, impactful literature. The timeline is important. Have a clear timeline as possible. There are no standards, but a Gantt chart is very helpful. Your projected outcomes and contributions must be clear for both the theoretical and practical implications. Student training. The depth of the student training that you're going to be providing is more important than the number of students that you'll be hiring. And also, it's important to have strong co-applicants, especially if you are not a traditional academic or if you are relatively junior. Now, this section is all about your CV. There was lots of information about this part. Your CV says everything about you, so make sure that it's clear to read and coherently formatted. There were 3 key areas that were given more attention by the review committee: research output, research impact, and student training or supervision. And the first of these categories, the research output, is the most important. When talking about research output, it's important to remember that with SSHRC, you are generally dealing with a committee of traditional academics. That means that the quality and quantity of journal publications on your CV, as well as the journals that you target in your knowledge mobilization plan, are important. So the most important output is journal publications. Other forms of output, such as books, chapters, conferences, blogs, etc., may be important to include, but they have little effect on the capability score, as it's called. Consult your journal, the journal rankings for your field of study. For example, if you take the school of business or the area of business, the ABDC journal quality list is what you should consult. And you'll notice they're ranked in that particular list from A to C, A being the most highly ranked and C the lower ranked. When it comes to quantity and quality, just using, again, the area of business as an example, a good capability score may mean that if you are co-authoring a paper with one other person and it's 25 to 30 pages in an A-rated journal, you'll need one of those per year. Or if you and another author are have a 25 to 30 page paper in a B-rated journal twice per year. That is just for things like accounting, finance, or economics, that sort of thing. It can be particular to which area, but that's one example how the capability score is given. And in the same area, a lower score would be if you've only had conferences attendance and presentations and only C-rated journals. That's going to give you a lower capability score. So that's something to keep in mind when you are looking out to publish. When it comes to sole versus multiple authors, both the number of co-authors and the page length are important. A 20-page paper with 3 authors was scored low. On the other hand, a 50-page cross-cultural paper with 3 or more authors scored relatively high, as did 1 and 2 author papers for the longer paper. With research impact, the extent to which your research has a demonstrable effect on business practice, public policies, and in academia measured by citations. These are all strong indicators and will favorably impact your capability score. When it comes to supervision, successful applicants must have a background in supervising graduate students. Doctorate supervision gets the most attention naturally. However, for smaller schools, master's and undergrad supervisions were relevant, and applicants from universities without doctoral programs were not penalized. And a few extra tips that we got from SSHRC in a past presentation from them. Get a peer review. Vanessa also already mentioned that, and of course that means building extra time into your proposal process. Use funder language. So be sure that you're reading the funder website, see how they phrase things, the terms that they use, and mirror what they say, mirror that in your proposal. Be thrifty, keep the budget lean. We've already talked a bit about that. Know the priority areas. Again, this goes back to reading the funding opportunity. Make sure that you know where their priorities lie so that you can align your proposal accordingly. And last but not least, don't forget to use the small RRU internal grants to help build your potential for success. And on that note, I will pass it over. I believe Deb is going to take it from here.
Thank you so much to Melanie and to Gwen and to Vanessa for the excellent presentation. I'm going to stop the recording now